if we continue to carry that baggage and continue to carry that antipathy towards each other, we ain't going to get any further forward. And it's a really difficult thing to do. It's a really difficult thing to let that baggage go. But I think it's really the only way that we can actually start to move forward collectively. And we can only do this together.
Thanks for speaking today, agreeing to take some time out to talk. Now, you were the GM for marketing and sales at Youth Hostel Association New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right.
So you've got a rough idea, well, more than a rough idea of the market and how it works. And you know, I know it's not necessarily part of the events sector, which is what we cover, but nevertheless, events is tied in, not least of all because of labour. So, I mean, could you give us some, just before we get cracking, some ideas of the idea of the shape and size of the backpacker market for New Zealand and its value?
In terms of the value of the youth market for New Zealand, it made up 25% of our total visitor arrivals, for starters. So just on its own, it was one of the largest segments of the visitor industry on its own. Now you're talking an industry in total that's worth $17 billion, makes up 25% of that. What's that, $4 billion? You take $4 billion, any industry in New Zealand, and say it's $4 billion industry and it's under strain, and there'd be all sorts of news media, but because it's absorbed within the tourism sector, it sort of just gets hidden away. And the beauty of the youth market is that they are the ones that are we know that they stay longer because they have their working holidays. They're the ones that go out into the regions, and they're the ones that also want to connect with New Zealanders and New Zealand culture and all of that type of thing as well. And part of the mission, if you like, of organizations like YHA and also other organizations like HACA is to get those people to understand New Zealand, to understand our culture, and for also to bring people together and understand each other's culture. And one of the biggest concerns, more of the underlying concerns that you have when you have all of these border closures, is people become isolated from each other. And the more isolated you become from each other, the more intolerant you become of each other's differences. And I think travel is an enormously important vehicle to get people to understand each other's cultures, each other's religions. And if we lose that habit of people having that OE, you know, going away, and you know, most people in New Zealand and Australia have had an OE. If you get out of that habit, and if you break it for too long, people will just go and do their career and will stop a lot more. There'll be a lot less of that genuine travel and genuine connection with other people and learning about how the world works. So that's sort of more of a top level, high level concern. But getting into the nitty gritty of the value, we had about 60 to 70,000 working for holiday youth in New Zealand each year for about 4 or 5 years. Now that's 60 or 70,000 people that has just been taken out of the workforce. They're no longer there, and that's why there's people, and these people would work in all sorts of industries, and that's why we're currently screaming out for people in everywhere, really, any industry you like. They're saying they're short of people. And what is not being dealt with at the moment is the fact that there's a particular pattern for working holidays coming into New Zealand. So they will take about 6 to 9 months to decide that they want to come here. The majority of them actually arrive in New Zealand around about August, September, October. So that 3 months is when the bulk of people arrive in New Zealand. If we don't get them their visas now, and I mean right now, and start opening up that pathway for people to come in, we're not going to get them in August, September, and we're going to lose another year. So we might open our borders in October, but they ain't coming unless we get them their visas now. So we need to start that pathway. We need to start thinking about the lead time and the lag for people to understand that we will be open and it will be okay for them to come in, and make it risk-free, so that if they do get their visa and we're still closed, that visa will roll over for a couple of years, so that they can feel that there's an opportunity there. So you know, we're looking at not just this year, but we're potentially 2 years away from actually getting people coming back in, and then probably another year or so before we start getting the numbers that we used to see. In the meantime, Canada and Australia and the States even, but Canada and Australia in particular, are basically opening their doors and saying, come on over. And we are looking at.
I mean, that's the immediate parallel with the events business. You know, even for the smallest event, you're looking 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 18 months notice. You're saying for the youth market, it's 9 months. You need 9 months at least before you start to see any kind of return, possibly a year and a half before, 2 years before you can get back to any kind of comparable levels to previous years. That's very, I mean, the whole thing is really sad, Brian, because the Youth Hostel Association in most countries, all countries where it operates, I would suggest is intrinsic to getting young people into the country and out and about into the regions and understanding how it works. And, you know, as we said earlier, you know, the fond memories that those people have when they visit countries like New Zealand stays with them forever. And it's good for the countries they visited. You haven't got that. And I'm sure young people will continue to come to New Zealand in the future, but it won't have the Youth Hostel Association to do it, or to help it along the way. And I think that's really sad.
I can answer you if I may about the youth hostel. Yeah. I think one of the things is you shouldn't underestimate the value and the quality of the rest of the backpacker market in New Zealand. We've got you know, I think there's about 200 to 300 backpackers left. A lot of them are really high quality. They're really good operators and they understand how the business works. And I think it's also really important that the organizations like BYADA, the Backpacker Association, are really focused on ensuring that sector remains cohesive and remains an active voice with people like Tourism New Zealand and the government, to make sure that our market is still focused on, but it's also managed in a way that our operators do give that quality service to the youth market. So I'm less catastrophic about the loss of YHA in New Zealand. It's definitely sad, and it's a terrible thing to happen, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be hugely detrimental to the youth market coming and exploring New Zealand, if the industry works together and ensures that they maintain that level of quality in there.
The only thing that I would say about that is that unfortunately, I don't hear people talking about New Zealand anymore. Yeah. And I think that could be a big issue as we move along. You know, earlier on, I heard people, you know, bitching about the fact they couldn't get over to New Zealand, or they were angry with what was going on over there, or, you know, angry with the leaders, that kind of thing. I don't even hear that, nothing. And I think that goes back to your point about being isolated, drifting further apart in terms of, you know, your viewpoints, becoming less intolerant, that kind of thing. So, okay, I think you've been pretty, you've got an optimistic or positive viewpoint on all of this. So if that's what's happened and that's where we are, and, you know, it's not a great place to be. And New Zealand is a long way from being out of the woods, that's for sure. Yeah. As is Australia, but I think we're a bit further ahead of the game, really. What does New Zealand have to watch out for, and what's the way what ways forward do you think there are for recovery and getting back to meeting other people from all over the world?
So I think there's a couple of things. Well, it's quite a lot of things, but a couple of the key things is it comes back to your point, is that we need to get out of our own heads in terms of how important and how good we are. We have this I think that we have had this philosophy that all we need to do is open the doors and people are going to come rushing down. It is a long way from anywhere, always has been. It's going to be a lot more expensive than anywhere. And a lot of the airlines are now pulling out, or there's limited airline capacity coming into the country. So we need to we need to put ourselves up to a mirror and actually look at where New Zealand stands globally, and what are our current and short-term risks and weaknesses that we need to address in terms of our positioning and who we are, how to get here, and who else is out there in terms of the other markets that are just picking up all of the business that we're just leaving on the table. And I'll go back to Canada again. And one of the real core risks is that multi-leg travel, where you've got to get on 2 flights. And if you think of travel as a confidence game, you've got to be really confident if you're going to travel halfway around the planet and feel that you're not going to get locked down or trapped or whatever. And if you're concerned about those types of things, you're more likely to go 1 flight leg than you are to go multiple flight legs and have to go through different countries. So that's a whole new perspective that we've never had before, and we need to address that. We need to think about what that means to us. And there's a whole and the confidence game is the big thing that I think most people are really struggling with in terms of the current narrative that comes out of the government, because there is no confidence, there's no certainty, there's no, everything continually changes. That's the nature of a pandemic, but there's no real there doesn't seem to be an evolution of the plan as the pandemic evolves. It seems to be we're dealing with the pandemic as we dealt with it in March 2020, as opposed to January 2022. And I think there needs to be a change of narrative around that, around how we are going to get people into the country, how we are going to open up, what our timelines are going to be, and how we're going to deal with it, the health crisis that is coming to us, but dealing with it as a health issue, not dealing it as an economic issue, or solving it through economic means, actually solving it through dealing with our health side of things. So that's the bigger picture. From an events and a visitor industry perspective, we've got our own challenges in terms of, you've already mentioned the workforce. We have to understand how are we actually going to make that work? If we don't have the people, how are we actually going to do that? And how are we going to do that regionally? We've got Wellington Convention Centre, Christchurch Convention Centre. They're now, I think Wellington's operational now, or very close to being operational. So they're big hubs that are going to suck up a lot of the regional event activity, because they're new, they're shiny, people are going to want to use those facilities. So there's probably going to be a 2 or 3 year lag domestically, because those facilities are going to be filled up. So how does that impact with the regions, and what can be done to try and proactively get events happening within the regions of New Zealand? And part of that could be a government driven initiative, by way of, there are thousands of government employees, there must be hundreds of government meetings and events. Get them out into the regions, get them out experiencing what New Zealand's like, and have their events out in the regions, and actually spend that money with those types of things, and support that sort of network until the rest of the world comes in to visit.
That's not a big deal though, is it? I mean, that's not a difficult thing to organise.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought so. So there's that, and again, we need to put from the event side of things, we need to put it in perspective. International delegates into events are not that big in New Zealand. It makes up about $200 million roughly, out of a much larger. It's about I think it's about 2 to 4% of the overall market are international delegates. So it's a nice cream on the top, and there's definitely potential once with those larger conference centres of bringing those people in. But our market is really domestic, and probably a bit of Australia as well, more so, but certainly domestic. And it's making sure that domestic market works for events, and again, giving that confidence. But underneath that, you need the infrastructure, you need the people. There's a lot of staff. Half of the people that have left YHA have left the industry, and that's happening throughout the country and across all of the businesses. So you're losing really good people. Are you losing that in the events industry? Probably.
Yes, definitely. I mean, absolutely. Probably 75%.
Yeah. Wow.
Would be a conservative estimate. And the issue across events and accommodation now is recruitment, is staff. And what's limiting, certainly on the east coast of Australia now, bed nights, if you like, or accommodation, or the number of events that organisations can handle, they're limited by the staff that they've got. So yes, it's huge.
Yep. So there are some really fundamental industry structural questions that hopefully the business events people, the associations and the relative regions are seriously thinking about, and how does that get managed? Because the last thing that you want is for us to have this boom that we can't service, because that will embed in people's memories how bad a region is or how bad a certain event was, and they just won't do it. And the other one is flipping the remote conferences and the technology conferences back to face-to-face conferences. And I think that there is quite a demand for face-to-face conferences. I think people want to get in touch with each other, but it's also being able to manage that. And that might be part of the solution in the short term, where you're short of staff, is actually growing in a managed way, using the technology to potentially keep your numbers down if you need to, but still have a good conference and still have a big conference. So there's a whole heap of really difficult and really big industry infrastructure questions that need to start being answered. That should be done in cooperation with the government agencies and government bodies, because they need to understand what the problems are so that they can manipulate the policies in order to help manage that.
Right, okay. That's the bit that I think is key to a lot of this, Brian, because, all of those questions that you've raised, they're quite exciting, to work out how you can achieve all this, how you can manage a temporary boom so that people come back in the future. And, they're great problems to have to deal with, and good fun as well. But you say they've got to be managed and thought through in cooperation with you, or in conjunction, if you like, almost with government agencies. That can only be done if those government agencies understand the value of what it is they might lose if they don't have things like events, things like the Youth Hostel Association, things like the youth market. I mean, do you think that they really, even after all this time, actually understand the true value of those markets?
It's a really good question, and I have my doubts. In New Zealand, tourism has never really been perceived as a real industry by the bureaucracy of government. It's always been something on the side. It's never really seemed to have been embedded within other larger industries, despite the value and despite the volume of money that it draws in. It's been quite it's a really interesting, and I've never understood it, how you've got $17 billion of foreign exchange earnings coming into the country every single year, yet you just treat it as it's a bit of fun. And I don't know if that's just because if you're not involved in the industry, the only experience of tourism is as a tourist, and you're on holiday and you're having fun. So hey, isn't it all fun? It's just a bizarre position to be in. So I'm not entirely sure that they do understand that, but that's not their problem. It's really important to state that it's not their problem, it's our problem, because we're not communicating it well enough. We are a very diverse and very fragmented industry. We haven't got ourselves together. A little bit of that is starting to happen in New Zealand, but not really well. And we're not communicating it. We're not communicating it loudly enough, and we're not communicating it with enough frequency for it to actually be embedded in people's heads. If somebody doesn't understand something, it's not their problem. It's the communicator that has the problem, and that's for us to deal with, for us to sort out.
So I mean, what you're saying there is that some sort of more coordinated approach collectively to communicate the issues to government. I mean, there is another way of looking at it, heaven forbid, Brian, is that the government at the end of the day are employees, and we are their employers. And if you have an employee that no matter how many times you explain the job to them, they don't get it, at some point you have to part company.
Yeah. Governments are made up of politicians. The people that run the country are the bureaucrats. And you can change government as much as you like, but unless you've got the bureaucracy, and I don't mean that in a detrimental term. Bureaucracy is always regarded as a detrimental term. I mean it as that's what they are. If you can get them on board and work with them in a positive and ways in which it is they understand the benefit to the country and the value and that type of thing, I think then you've won half the battle, because they're the ones that advise government. You know, most politicians actually that's not fair. Most politicians have got so much work on that they can't know everything about everything, and they always get advice, and it's always coming from their bureaucratic infrastructure. So that's the area that needs work. They're the ones that make the policy, that give the policy to the ministers to say, this is what we think you should be doing. So they're the ones that would need to work.
Okay, I mean, that's a fair comment. So you're suggesting focus more on the actual, let's not call them bureaucrats, but agencies working within government, civil servants, if you like, to get those people on board. I mean, nevertheless, though, the power of, if you're not going to listen to me, I won't vote for you next time, does have some power, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Of course it does. But there's a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of those conversations from all sorts of different sectors. And I'm just not convinced that an aggressive attacking mode is the right way. I think it should be. I think we need to focus on what are the benefits, focus on the facts that are in front of us, and just keep repeating them. And just keep repeating them. You know, the messages and it's how politicians work. They will be on the TV or on the radio, and they will say the same thing time and time again, so that you're absolutely sick to death with it. We don't do that. We sort of talk about it sort of for a short spell, and then we'll move on to a different subject. We'll find a different piece that we want to get angry about, and we're not consistent.
People say the facts speak for themselves, but actually they don't.
No.
You have to keep speaking those facts and statistics, as you say, until people get sick of them.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting way of looking at it. Okay, so looking at the people that work within government, not just the politicians, keep repeating the facts. Become more consolidated as a disparate group involved within tourism. Is there anything specific in New Zealand?
I think one of the fundamentals for New Zealand across the board is a lack of staffing and a lack of resourcing. I think what we need to focus on is a grown-up conversation about how we do open the borders, on how we do get people in a safe and managed way, and do it, and who are we going to focus on first. We need to have an immigration discussion that makes it really clear about who we're going to allow in, the type of people that we want in. So for me, it's students working for holidays, and those skilled, and students and working for holidays, then that's not an immigration product, that's a visitor product, but they provide a resource in terms of short-term staffing on an ongoing basis, particularly in the regions. And there should be mechanisms in place, and there should be conversations in place around how do we get those people in, and how do we enable things like self-isolation and managing all of those things through, and how do we make it work? Because without those people, without that infrastructure, you're not going to be able to deliver the services and deal with any boom that comes later on. And those people in themselves are probably a more easily controlled cohort of visitors, a large number of visitors, but actually quite easily controlled, because that you know who they are, you know where they're going to go, they're going to work, they're going to, I mean, for example, you could get working holiday people in working in dairy farms. Dairy farms have their own accommodation, they're isolated, you can deal with all of those types of things. That type of stuff can happen now. Underneath all of that, of course, is dealing with all of the people that want to get back into New Zealand that can't get in anyway, so having mechanisms for that. But actually thinking through, having that dialogue to say, how do we actually make this work? What's happened has happened, that's in the past. Draw a line and say, this is where we are right now. We know that it's coming. How do we actually deal with it, and what do we need to do to actually deal with it? And what are going to be the no-go areas in terms of what are the absolutes in terms of lockdowns or closing things up or not letting people in, and then how do we go back from there? They're the conversation, and we just need to keep having those conversations and just keep asking the question, but asking the questions in a moderate and less emotive way in which we're asking them now. Because at the moment we're really angry and we're shouting at each other, and when we're shouting at each other, nothing happens. We also need to stop catastrophizing everything and looking at things in a binary fashion. So you talk to some people and say, right, we need to open our borders in a controlled manner. The other side will go, oh, you're going to kill us all because we're all going to get COVID and we're all going to die. And it's sort of like you have these really polar views kicking in right from the outset. And it's about sort of coming into the middle and saying, look, we can do this. We know we can do this. We just need to be clever about it and actually have the desire to do it in the first place. But just keep asking.
I mean, it's not a surprise though, is it, that you've got those polar views, much of which, nearly all of which actually has been created through fear, people being frightened. Looking at it from my point of view is that a lot of this is a catastrophic problem of the governments, their agencies, and the media's making.
Yeah, and you know, you can agree with that, but we've also what I'd like to see is us basically say, put all of that baggage that we've got on at the moment, is just get rid of it and start again, and just look at this as a problem and go, right, we've been landed this problem in January 2022. We've got no borders open. We've got a potential for New Zealand, we've got the potential opening of borders with a highly infectious disease coming across the borders. What do we need to do in order to manage ourselves out of this situation now? Forget everything else that's happened in the past. Well, how do we move forward from here and actually try and drop that baggage? Because if we continue to carry that baggage and continue to carry that antipathy towards each other, we ain't going to get any further forward. And it's a really difficult thing to do. It's a really difficult thing to let that baggage go. But I think it's really the only way that we can actually start to move forward collectively. And we can only do this together. We can't do this as disparate groups fighting each other all the way through. We have to look at this as a collective problem and see how we can deal with it together. And I don't know if that's even possible at the moment, the way everybody's entrenched, but I'd be appealing to everybody's just take a breath, drop the baggage and focus on what's in front of us, because there's no point looking at what's happened in the past because it's done and dusted. Let's deal with what's ahead of us.
Using our indoor voices.
Using our indoor voices, exactly.
I mean, the other thing with all of this is that it could well be that Omicron, which it is looking like is turning out to be as deadly as a bad cold, could end up making a mockery of all of our restrictions and all of our presumptions about everything that's going on and get us back to normality. Certainly here in Australia, within the space of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Queensland went through a situation where if you're a tourist and you drove through a hotspot, which was a place of high infection, to get to Queensland, which would be 90% of all road traffic, you had to have a PCR test within 5 days before, a PCR test 5 days after, your border pass, and of course be fully vaccinated. Now, if you imagine the logistical issues for a family with 3 kids, not least of all sticking a big Q-tip up a child's nose, it's just not pleasant. Now, within 5 days, I think it was the second PCR test went out the window because there was no point. It just didn't work. And then there were so many people being tested, they shifted to rapid tests, which they were adamant they weren't going to use. And then we've moved on from that to actually we probably won't need rapid testing for any interstate travel anywhere, with obviously the exceptions of Western Australia at the moment. And that's within the space of just a couple of weeks. Now, if we end up with a situation where every man and his dog is being infected with a virus that actually isn't really that dangerous anymore, you can't have people isolating, and already that is proving to be true. It could well be that Omicron makes everything obsolete just purely from a logistical point of view, and then it's governments walking backwards, walking back from their earlier decisions with some degree of dignity.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be really careful around how we portray Omicron and the impacts of that. It is spreading really quickly. It is highly infectious. There are people that are getting into hospitals. They might not be critical, but they are still clogging up the hospital system and the health system. And that's where I come back to that it's a health issue and it should be dealt with by investing in the health resources and managing those resources. And it's a little bit of exactly what I was saying before around looking forward and drawing a line, because if you look at Omicron, what there has been put in place is people have been looking backwards at how we dealt with the previous infections and using those tools instead of looking forwards and going, okay, well, this is different. We're going to have mass infection. We knew we were going to have mass infection. Can we actually deal with PCR tests? What tools do we have available to deal with mass outbreaks? How do we change what we've done in order to understand what's going on? Do we worry about case numbers anymore? Do we worry about hospitalizations? And who are the people that we need to be protecting? Is it the old and the young that we need to be protecting and focusing on those people and isolating those people if they need to be isolated? So again, it's looking at these instead of fighting a battle using bows and arrows, you want to be having a look at fighting a battle using bullets and guns. You know, it's a completely different battle that we're in now with Omicron, and it's the same thing, both from a dealing with the pandemic itself and also dealing with the other things that get impacted by it. And it's, we know that there seems to be a lack of foresight and a lack of imagination coming up, and we can see it working in what's happening overseas. We've had the privilege of having that delay, so you're hoping that your people that are in charge have got the imagination and the skills and the brain power to be able to start thinking forward and planning forward, but it just all seems so very reactionary. And I think that's the biggest frustration, is the reactiveness as opposed to the foresight and the planning of what's coming up. And you can't tell me that they can't see it coming. We can see it coming. And you know, you have conversations all over the place where people are predicting what it's going to be like. But don't underestimate the impact it has on our health system. It's a massive impact on our health system. Might not be killing people, but it's having a massive impact on clogging up the health system.
Well, one of the biggest impacts it's having on the health system in the UK, for example, we'll talk about England, is not necessarily the admissions, but staff who are asymptomatic having to isolate because they tested positive.
Yep.
Now, you could argue that's not necessarily a health issue. It's a policy problem.
Yep.
Nevertheless, as you say, you know, we've got the benefit of almost hindsight, I suppose, because we can see what's happened in South Africa, in the UK, and you know, we can pick the good bits, the bad bits, but that doesn't. I think we're both in agreement that doesn't seem to be happening.
No, it doesn't.